Tonight we're going to prove once again that it is possible to have civil, productive, enjoyable and enlightening discussion and a civil discourse about some of the most challenging issues that are within our communities. And I can't think of anything more important and more urgent right now than housing. I'm Cathy McDermott, I'm your MC tonight. But I think what we're now feeling in the midst of where we are right now is there's been a lot of talking. And I think we're all in fierce agreement that we have to bring it all into a much sharper focus and a call to action as we experience a housing crisis and a level of homelessness I think none of us could ever believe would have ever happened in Australia. I'm a super keen supporter of the Brisbane Dialogues over the last 3 to 4 years. And in particular, what I love about it is its commitment to promote respectful discussion and to really avoid that win-lose polarising debate that we often see in political debate and also in the media. Housing is recognised as a fundamental human rights by the United Nations, and we know it's critical to people's health and well-being, their education, their employment, prosperity, and of course their safety. But the problem is big, the solutions are complex, and the stories are hard-hitting. So this is a really good time to restate the Brisbane Rule, which was specially created for the Brisbane Dialogues when it was launched 4 years ago. All participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussions, not on the characters. And that extends before, during, and after tonight, online as well as offline. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. My first introduction and welcome is for Dr. Cameron Murray. Cameron is the Chief Economist of Fresh Economic Thinking Australia and author of a newly released book. They love you. The newly released book, I'm even going to hold it up, The Great Housing Hijack. Welcome to Claire O'Rourke, owner and director of Cohere Projects, an active and expert representative on a number of industry bodies. Claire was certainly very active and very generous in sharing her expertise on the Property Council. She is the chair of the Urban Land Institute in Queensland and importantly on their National Council. Welcome to Jackson Hills, Manager of Policy and Strategic Engagement for Q Shelter. Jackson is a social and affordable housing advocate and director, and he recently joined the Queensland Advisory Board for the Property Industry Foundation. Welcome to Natalie Raymond, Co-Chair and Executive Director of the Walton Construction Consulting Group. Natalie is co-founder of the YIMBY Queensland, which stands for Yes in My Backyard, and she is a member of the Queensland Housing Supply Expert Panel. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Professor Peter Shergold, AC. Peter is a former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister, former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Chancellor of Western Sydney University between 2011-2022, and he is a passionate advocate of the transformational power of higher education, innovation in the public sector, social justice and social inclusion. With an outstanding career in public service, education, and as a company director and chair, Peter brings an expert and diverse perspective to tonight's dialogue and moderation. So please welcome Peter and all the panellists. We look forward to a terrific discussion.
The challenges of accessibility and affordability has rapidly moved over the last 12 months, from being a housing problem to a crisis, to a long-standing crisis, to the worst housing crisis on record. We're told in very loud headlines that the housing system is broken. There has been a historic underinvestment in housing, but most of all that there has been inadequate and declining public investment, particularly in terms of providing a range of public and social housing. And as a result, housing supply, we're told, isn't keeping pace with the rate of population growth. And as a result of that, there is worsening affordability for renters, but also for first home buyers. But it goes deeper than that, Because what is also suggested is that it's disadvantaged Australians who are increasingly bearing the brunt of that through housing insecurity, homelessness, and beyond that, that one of the contributors now to the significant decline in mental health and the challenges to social cohesion are in part coming from the housing crisis we face.
I've been interested in housing for many years. I've participated as an investor, as a renter, as a homeowner, and for the last 4 years at the University of Sydney, studied housing supply and the economic dynamics there. To start with my favourite quote to set the scene on my views on housing, from a very, very famous visitor to Sydney. They wrote in their diary on their first day when they visited that the number of large homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. That wasn't Taylor Swift in her Eras tour in 2024. It was Charles Darwin in 1836 when the population of Sydney was 20,000. We've had the same property market cycles and the same similar debates at each point in it. The problem seems to be that when we have this boom in the economy, people have to compete with other people to stay living where they are when they're renting. If everyone else's income goes up and yours doesn't, you have to outbid them for the same house. So there's an adjustment process of the market. Some people win and some people lose, and I think that's where we are now. I can tell you that when you survey renter households, the rent-to-income ratio in 2021 was 20%. Imagine if all rents and prices fell 25% in the Australian housing market. Our $10 trillion worth of housing is worth $7.5 trillion. Anyone whose mortgage is 80% of their housing value is now underwater. Landlords, instead of making $66 billion in total revenue, make $50 billion. I'm not sure that that is politically feasible or that's the way we should frame our housing discussion. I think we need to frame it as this market adjustment process. So I'll leave you with that and let the rest of the panellists share their thoughts.
Thanks, Peter. Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire O'Rourke and I've spent the last 20 years developing residential projects. I've worked for large corporate developers like Mirvac and Lendlease, and then more recently I've been running a project management business. But now my time is spent really just delivering my own projects. So I focus on that, and tonight I'm bringing the real life development perspective to the conversation. Housing, what do we want to achieve? Is a pretty simple one for me. I want to have a market that is predictable and stable, where supply matches demand, where we don't have governments that intervene with policies that distort the industry's ability to operate. I want a market that's in equilibrium, where house prices and rents grow at moderate and sustainable levels that is close to CPI. Unfortunately, house prices have risen 55% since 2019, and a big driver of that demand was an access to cheap credit and prolonged low interest rate environment and the poorly executed home builder grant, which artificially pulled forward years of demand and gifted $2.3 billion to home buyers. It also sparked serious escalation in building costs that we're still paying for. And look, demand is still high, but now we're facing the most severe construction conditions that I have ever seen in the last 20 years. And the fact is, we just need more builders and we need more workers. And right now, I don't know why anyone would want to be a builder. They're over-regulated, unprotected, and marginal businesses.
Housing boomed in Australia after the World War. People needed homes and work, so Menzies put them back to work with the big build. Between 1947 and 1971, the number of dwellings in Australia increased from 1.9 million to 4 million. I'm sure many of you understand and appreciate this history. During that era, there were fewer regulations, modest building standards, far less competition for government spending. In 1956, about 14% of all those residential dwellings were public housing. Today, that's closer to 3.6%. I'm sure we'll discuss that tonight. Fast forward to 2024. The recently established National Housing Supply and Affordability Council released its first State of the Housing System report only a few weeks ago. The report emphasises that Australia is currently facing a housing crisis and predicts that housing affordability will worsen in the near term. Describes a perfect storm in which high interest rates, construction constraints, labour shortages, increased migration and decline in social housing investment over the last 4 decades has all left the country with demand excessively outstripping supply, leading to skyrocketing housing costs. I wanted to just pluck 5 of their performance measures that the same report talks about on what a future optimal housing environment might look like. I think that might set the scene a bit tonight. 1, housing is affordable, fit for purpose and secure for households across income and geography. 2, there's a fair access to home ownership or alternative tenures with comparable benefits. 3, there's secure, dignified housing for tenants with a sufficient return for investors. 4, there's a supply of new, well-located housing that matches the needs of the Australian growing population. And 5, experiences of homelessness are brief, rare and non-recurring. So I'm going to finish it there, Pete. Hopefully that sets the scene.
So I come from the deep belief that housing is a human right. I guess I'm there with Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, and he put it right there with food and water, and I hold that belief true. I'm aware that it is at an international level recognised as a human right, but in our laws in Australia it's not recognised. We've got a right to vote, we've got a right to a fair trial, we've got a right to religious freedom and to not be discriminated against. We've got a right to acquire property. If we look at our state Human Rights Act, we have a right to privacy. We have a right to participate in public life. We have a right to access health services. We have a right to education, but we don't have a right to a roof over our heads. I come to that as a planner, so I guess bring a different perspective from others on the panel. I come to it with over 25 years of experience preparing, lodging or assessing and deciding or giving evidence in court about development applications. So I've seen a lot come across my desk or in front of me, and I can see what impact the planning system has on housing. It can be a barrier to certain types of housing or locations of housing, and therefore the price, the size, the tenure, the form of housing. It can also absolutely be a solution.
The industry is actually asking for 486,000 migrants. These are new people who have the right skills that can help deliver the housing that we need. But we didn't get that. We got 1,900. So it feels like the unions are running the country, and it suits them to keep wages high, to keep migrants low, because it keeps us wages high. So right now we have a huge demand pressure, but a construction industry that just can't manage the workload. And no one wants to believe it, but our housing crisis is about to get a whole lot worse, and unless there is a full reset in our industry.
Do not get comfortable in your seat.
Okay, Pete.
You never know when it's coming.
So
it
look,
is like the hand of God.
All right, Peter. I do accept where Claire's coming from. I think to go a little bit further on the government's role, and I mentioned the big build in my opening remarks, there's no big public workforce anymore. I mean, the government just does contracts with the private sector to build that stock. So I think essentially we're talking about the same thing. It's the capacity and productivity of the construction workforce. The same workforce is building the same stuff, building the bridges, building the hospitals, building the homes. And that is absolutely a challenge that we're worried about too, Claire. And as a sector that relies on partnerships with the private industry to build stuff at scale, it's particularly concerning. But I'll be a bit controversial and say that I do applaud the government, the state government and federal government for setting some targets, because, I know those targets are controversial and have every chance of maybe not being reached. But I think aspiration's important. And I think aspiration can drive innovation. And something that I think our sector is desperately needing is more innovation and technology development. I know there's people in the audience that are involved in that part of the system. So if anything, I would love to see more focus going into that while we work through this construction industry crunch.
What do you mean by a human right? Because I think even you accepted, as you were talking about your vision of what we needed, that in our society we have a right to hold private property. What is the human right there that you want to be? I know. I can see Cameron's bouncing. That's why I've done it last.
It's a human right for all. I would like to see housing for all in our country. And I think it's an interesting thing for me to see that education is for all. If we look at the supply of schools across Queensland, there's around 10,000 schools. About 2/3 of those public schools. If we look at housing, what's the percentage? About 3.6% of our housing in Queensland is social and public housing. So we haven't been providing enough. No wonder it's not a human right.
Well, hang on a moment. Hang on.
That.
We've got 420 dwellings in Australia per 1,000 people. 420. Now, it's true, if you go to Italy, they've got 600. But 420 is about what you've got in the United States, the same as Canada, same as New Zealand, give or take. And if you look at Europe, I can think of 10 countries where the number of dwellings per 1,000 people is less than we've got. So I'm trying to get, well, what's the problem? What's the crisis here?
People sleeping rough, people not having a shelter, people not having a home to live in, so that's one. And I think it's interesting because, of course, it affects the most vulnerable in our community the most, and young people trying to get into the housing market. So that's where I think it's hitting most. We've got, a community of young people thinking that they're never going to have the opportunity for home ownership in our country.
Cameron, I bought your book. No, I haven't bought your book. I haven't read your book. I've read the back cover of your book before we started. And depending what happens tonight, I may well go and buy your book. But you think this whole housing debate has been hijacked. So tell me why.
Maybe I'll talk about the need for more construction skills. I don't think changing immigration solves that, right? So all my adult life, we've had skills shortages and skills shortages lists and immigration trying to address them, and nothing's changed. Right? Because the competition for workers comes from the economy generally, right? People can shift into other things. So it's always the case, when the economy's hot, it's hard to hire someone in every sector. And of course, an extra 100,000 people need an extra 42,000 dwellings, right? And we only build 160,000, right? So it's a massive, massive increase in what we need to just accommodate the people who are meant to build houses. So I don't think that works mathematically. On the human right, I agree, that's why I've proposed in the book, we should treat housing a bit more like public schools, and everyone should have the option, if they need, to have this sort of backup social insurance in housing. And I'm pretty agnostic on how to do that. And I think for me, that's one of the, what do we want from housing? I want a backup from the market, however we do that. That would be my thing. And the last thing before I turn it back over, I've been on panels like this in Wellington, Vancouver, Sydney, Melbourne, in the last 6 months, and every city has said to me, oh, we're the worst for housing, aren't we? No, it's our politicians, it's our this. And I'm like, this is every city right now. Could it not be that the macroeconomy that we're all experiencing jointly, this is a symptom of that macroeconomic process, the inflation, for example, that we've seen? Because, everyone else has it. So I think it's always good to zoom out and look abroad and look at Europe, and they're having the same problems, and their unions aren't as bad as ours, but they're having the same problems. Price to income ratio, we should never use that. $1 million house is cheap when interest rates are 2%. It costs you 20 grand a year to rent the money. Right? So you've got a $100,000 house, you can rent $1 million and live in it. But at 8% interest rate, costs you 80 grand in interest. $1 million house is very expensive. So the same price to income ratio has a very different sort of meaning. So I think if you are musing like what caused that high price to income ratio, it's interest rates.
What we're on about is choice.
Yep.
Housing choice, housing diversity, options. People can freely participate and have the ability to participate with some equity across the housing spectrum. And so one of the things I want to pick you up on, Pete, is the home ownership rate has changed. It's actually declined. It's trending down, particularly with different age cohorts. And so the example Cameron gave is an example of outright ownership. I mean, if I'm still paying off my mortgage, I'm struggling in some cases at the moment, depending on when I got into the market. So I think when we talk about home ownership, we talk about that 60% figure, which for the last 3 decades it's trending down. That means that we've got lifelong renters entering into the marketplace. Yep. It means that people that are making a choice to stretch into the home ownership market when they probably can't afford to, because they're struggling to live in this fragile rental market at the moment, because they don't want to change rental properties with their kids 5 times in 4 years. I just think sticking in the abstract too long here, we miss a lot of nuance in this current debate. But I actually think government does have a role to play, Pete, and I'll tell you where I think it is. It's in helping people on the bottom 2 income quintiles. It's that disadvantaged community. We're privileged enough in Australia to live in this civilised society where I think we do need a safety net. The question is, what is the safety net and how does it apply to the housing market?
But then maybe, as you're talking about it, the housing crisis is not really a housing crisis at all. It's actually a manifestation of income inequality and people who don't have the resources. I mean, if you think about the pandemic crisis, there were lots of bad things, but one of the things that was very positive, I think, was the extent to which Commonwealth government came in quickly with JobSeeker and JobKeeper, not to everyone, but so the argument then was that for those in the most disadvantaged situations, the lowest income, so maybe all the housing crisis is, you know, a small but important chunk of a much bigger crisis.
I think we're getting down to the point. It's not like a general crisis, is it? Because I would like all the homeowners to put their hands up. Everyone who's a homeowner. And now just leave them up if you're having the worst housing crisis of your life, and the rest of you put them down. Okay. Now the renters can put their hands up. Not that many. And then leave them up if you're having the worst housing crisis of your life, and everyone else can put them down. Okay, so we've got about 8 people out of 230. Okay, so we're down at 3%. So it doesn't.
I think it
really
depends which room you're in, Cameron. I know the rooms I go to around the state, the numbers are a lot higher.
But let's be clear. Of course, you can, 3% of 26 million is a lot of people if you get them all in one room too. But if you go out on the street, it's a small number.
And
right?
you'll also bump into 100,000 people sleeping rough.
It is this intergenerational. So I have to say, I look around this room and there are people of a certain late youth in the audience. And people of my age, if you ask us, of course, we're saying, let our house prices rip. Why do we want to keep house prices down? That's actually how we're making our wealth. It is the young ones coming in who get told by the bank to go to the bank of mum and dad to help them. And my, I suppose, concern there is what you're doing, and Australia hasn't done this in the past, but has the potential that what you're doing through the housing market, house ownership market, is actually you are starting to build in social inequality or less social mobility, because it's those of us in the market now with the houses that can then assist our children and grandchildren.
I think that's why the YIMBY message really resonates with young people.
Yeah.
They've got skin in the game, they're out there and they're really saying, is there room in this city for me?
This is one of the problems I got with the market. So I know much more about Sydney than Brisbane, but I can't help finding, as we're increasing the density of housing, and I don't mind increasing the density of housing, I'd like to get rid of a lot of that regulation, it somehow doesn't seem to apply to the suburbs that already have the wealthiest houses. We keep building more in terms of the low-income ends of town. Now, is that just the market working, or do you have any concerns of that in your ideal model?
I think now we're starting to see a bit of a change where we are focusing on the missing middle and having that in the right locations with the right amenity and infrastructure and access to shops and to transport. And I think there is now a willingness at different levels of government to have more affordable housing in areas that previously didn't want it. I think the biggest issue that our industry is facing is more around, it's not that hard to get approvals in Brisbane. The local councils and the state government is actually really trying to facilitate development at the moment. 20,000 dwellings that were approved last year. The issue that we have is not around approvals, it's around delivery. And it doesn't matter how many approvals you can get if the project is not viable. And that is the issue that we're facing.
So I understand it's not no regulation. At a certain stage, government's regulations can be helpful, but the fundamental problems you're talking about, which I'm very sympathetic to, the cost of labour, the cost of procurement, the cost of supplies from overseas, which is clearly reflected in the cost of housing at the moment, combined with difficulties with regulation. What should government do in that instance?
I just think the issue that we have now is there is a lot of money being pumped into this sector. We're trying to suck it up through a straw because we're relying on community housing providers to partner with developers to deliver on the 14,000 homes that the government is now promising, or whatever the number is. Sorry, I've probably got that wrong. But it is a huge, investment that they are doing. So they are helping. Unfortunately, it comes back to capacity and resources and the ability for the construction industry to deliver the houses for the social and affordable housing, the CHPs. And I'm sure, Jackson, you're probably advocating on that as well. It's not my space. But yes, government regulation is important, and I think they are trying. But I also think that over-regulation is not healthy for our industry, and we need to be able to go and hire the builders that we want, hire the trades that we want. We need to be able to negotiate contracts on our own terms. We can't have the government running that aspect of our business, which is what is happening.
Now, if we were in a Teams meeting right now, I can see that both Cameron and Jackson are putting up their little golden hands. So, Cameron and then Jackson.
Can I get a question in? Is that allowed?
Yeah, you can do anything.
Maybe Claire and Natalie, I agree there are a lot of bad regulations. I'm an economist, right? I'm going to agree with that. How much cheaper would rents be, and how many fewer homeless people do we think there would be if there was, less
housing,
union?
More housing would deliver
there's
an
more
extra
houses
20%
than ever,
in
right?
housing, in supply, would drop rents by 10%.
20% of the total stock. So 2.2 million
to increase
homes.
stock, it would reduce its supply and demand, and you're an economist. It is the most basic elements of our economy. By increasing supply, you've reduced pricing.
But you keep coming
Just
back
remember-
to that
just remember-
stock. I'm just interested
Let
in this.
that one play out. I'd like to see what that does.
Keep going.
Okay.
Go on.
Let's get in a time machine and go back 30 years and have this conversation. You've told me, it's supply. If there's more housing, rents will come down. And I tell you, I'm from 2024. I'm in the Princess Theatre arguing with you that we actually have increased more housing per person than any point in human history, and you're still telling me we haven't solved it. So how would you convince that time traveller
Were you around in 2016 when we delivered 10,000 apartments into the market in Brisbane? That had a massive impact on prices and rents. It took years for us to absorb that supply. And I think
and then so we slowed down building after that, did we?
basically what happened was there was a huge supply from 2014, 16, and then their market basically had to mop it up from 2017 and 18. So we had an oversupply of apartments in Brisbane. And then what happened in 2019 was there was a $2.3 billion government fund called the Home Builder Grant, which basically pulled forward years and years and years of demand for us to deliver it all in one time. And there were capacity strengths in the market to deliver all of that.
Oh, I agree with that. I agree with that. What I'm saying
is,
you've just said that you supplied a lot of homes, but then you had to stop. So how do we know?
Because we're land banking. We're land banking.
How do we know that if we change this situation, we won't also find ourselves in 2028 in the same situation and slowing down again? You see what I'm saying? Like there's a cycle.
I see what you're saying. I tell you what I'm feeling. I've lost control of the moderation here.
Because it comes down to project viability.
I think we all agree it's a good thing to try and build more housing, a greater diversity of housing. But I'm going to do one of yours now. Let us imagine you've got 1,000 people in front of you and you've got 420 dwellings. Who here doesn't think they could find a way to distribute 1,000 people around 420 dwellings in a sensible way? So what I'm suggesting is not that we don't need more housing, but surely the problem is the way this housing's actually being distributed. You could imagine that number of dwellings for that number of people perfectly well. It's not perfectly well because of the distribution. And I suppose part of it comes back in this. Are investors, therefore, who own 2, 5 or 10 dwellings, part of the problem or part of the solution?
Well, that's a jam-packed question there, that one.
Yeah, I know.
Well, what's the role of governments? And I still make the point, it's in that sub-market housing space where they can't deliver sub-market product without government investment. Won't change in the future. Hasn't changed in the past. Government has a role to play with capital or subsidy or land or something there in between. And so in terms of delivering sub-market housing, it's absolutely crucial that there's support from government. Your point about the rental market is it predominantly relies on mum and dad investors. 95% of that market own 1 or 2 properties. 20,000 Australians, I think, have a large portfolio. So I think when we frame this argument, we've got to really look at the ABS stats and kind of understand what that looks like. So the 1 and 2 properties owned by mum and dad investors, it's a fragile market for us to rely on, particularly for vulnerable Australians. I mean, it needs to be diversified. It needs more institutional ownership. And one of the quickest ways to deliver that over time is funding the not-for-profit sector, who does the heavy lifting in other countries around the world. And that's the community housing sector. And I see some of them in the audience tonight. They are effectively the first players in the build-to-rent space, where they take an entire property and provide rental product. It sits in that subsidised market in perpetuity, and it continues to reinvest in itself over time and grow if the government supports it. And we've had a real issue with that in Queensland with the government settings to enable that sector to grow, and it can do a big part of the heavy lifting in the future if we get those settings right. There's a variety of ways you can do it. I mean, the state government in Queensland, for example, have a public housing portfolio of 73,000 properties, which is quite large, second oldest public housing authority in the country, in fact, behind South Australia, I think. Our sector manages about 12,500 of those properties on short-term leases from the government. They can't leverage that. to grow. They can't really debt finance against that to grow. In other states and territories, they've been supported by their state government to have some of those assets transferred to them onto their balance sheet so they can debt finance against that portfolio and build more properties themselves. I do think that's a small part of this. It's not the mainstream part. It's a very small part of it. But the part that continues to get missed in this equation is the bottom two income quintiles. And one of the reasons why I think the reason why it's so fierce is because this issue is impacting third quintile and fourth quintile. So people in this audience are struggling with housing now. And I think that's why it's in the paper every day, and it's why it's in the news every day, and it's why it's on the TV. But historically, it has always been difficult for the bottom two income quintiles, and it always requires government support and subsidy.
My question is, do you want to do that? Do you want to keep giving tax concessions for investing in property for other people to rent?
I don't want to make that decision for anyone. Through my 20s and 30s, a little bit similar to Nat's story, I rented all around the country because it was convenient. I had the ability to choose to do that. I could pay more than 30% of my income in rent if I wanted to live in a more desirable location. I actually had the luxury to make that choice. I think that luxury is becoming harder and harder for more Australians at the moment, maybe for various economic factors, but there's some groups that don't have that choice.
Because I've been involved in organisations that have, I think, been quite successful in finding housing for those people. But I have to say, when I'm dealing with it, I'm not sure I'm dealing again with a housing crisis. Because the only way I have found to make it successful is if you wrap around many of those people with help on some substance abuse problems, help in mental health. There are a whole series of reasons, not just income, which mean for that really bottom of the market, it's beyond, I suppose, a housing crisis. It's something else.
I absolutely agree. It's something else, but I think that there are so many factors contributing to it. One experience I had, someone who was wanting to set up and provide emergency shelter. So effectively, people are sleeping rough outside, where he wanted to invite them in and let them sleep in an empty car park underneath an office building overnight. Let them go back over day, but let them have a good night's sleep to help them get on with a better life. A lot of support, a lot of community development officers in the council said, great, but you better go and talk to a town planner. And that's when he had a problem. It's difficult. So this challenge that people have to build housing,
so it was the town
shelters,
planner that did it.
Well, I think this is something that people don't quite understand, that planning doesn't discriminate, perhaps. So if you're doing a development that could be an emergency shelter, it could be a luxury homes at $4 million, it still goes through our planning system and it can be very challenging. So we're trying to find ways to unlock that so that you can supply the housing that we need much more quickly.
So I hope very much that you found it useful. I found it useful. I found it very difficult to control this wonderful panel. They have been a great panel. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm going to hand back the microphone.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the panel. Now, Peter, I know you say you lost control, but I think it was a lesson in excellent moderation, which we always say is the essential ingredient of the Brisbane dialogue. And I think what we saw tonight was two great features: a terrifically curated panel, different expertise, different views, respectful conversation, and a real adherence to the Brisbane rule. We saw a spirited, insightful discussion, and for that I thank Cameron, Claire, Jackson, Natalie, and again Peter. It's amazing to have Peter here, that he could find time to be part of tonight. He had travelled up from Sydney to be part of it today in his busy schedule, and as you can appreciate, there's a lot of preparation. And then just to be able to wrap up all those concepts and thoughts, as you did so beautifully, we really appreciate it. So please join me in thanking the panellists and Peter. Thank you. Really relaxed. Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. I want to thank you all for your role in tonight, being here, being so engaged, putting those questions, listening to the different views. And I really encourage us all to encourage this conversation in our workplaces, in our homes, and across all our networks. Good night. Have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.